Hello, I'm back. I had not planned on doing an 11th lecture, but I think maybe I will add a few more as the spirit moves or whatever. And it did occur to me, even with the 10 lectures that I put online already, there's a lot more that could be said. And in particular, I wanted to talk today, probably don my linguist cap a little bit more, and talk about some features of the Indus language that we can infer from the script. Now, of course, by Indus language, I mean that this is clearly an early form of Indo-Aryan. I think that's established beyond any reasonable doubt from the previous lectures. The problem, though, is that we don't have any long inscriptions with a lot of morphosyntax and that kind of thing, and so what we're able to infer about the language is relatively limited, but there's some interesting, intriguing, tantalizing facts, some of which I've mentioned already passim in previous lessons or lectures. But it occurred to me that, in particular, my explanation of the form ati and its uses, we talked about atima and so forth and so on, that it suffered from a lack of actual illustration of what I was talking about. It seems very obvious to me because I've thought about it a while and taken notes on it, looked at the paper, but I thought, well, that really is something that's worth showing. So, for those of you who have already seen the 10 previous lectures, this will make this is something that draws on them. If you haven't watched all 10 of them, don't bother to watch this one until you've watched all the other 10, because some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this script, in this relatively short lecture, I have mentioned before. Okay, well, I don't need to want to make it any longer than necessary. My voice is a little bit weak. With the change in the weather, I've kind of got a bit of a dry, sore throat, so we'll do the best that we can. Again, I'm Steve Bonta, and if you've watched some of these lectures already, you're familiar with my line of thinking. So as I said, we're talking, first of all, with the main language. Now, probably not the only language, but the main language encoded in the Indus inscriptions is clearly an early form of Indo-Aryan. That is shown by the abundance of names and titles that we have managed to decipher already, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt, and whatever else might be said. But of course, Indo-Aryan in the form of Sanskrit or Pali, or even the Indo-Iranian languages like Avestan. And that is a bit of an open question, by the way, whether this language was antecedent to the Indo-Aryan, Indo-Iranian split or not. It's not entirely clear. So, this may also be ancestral to Avestan. If you're not familiar with Indo-Iranian linguistics, Avestan is the oldest attested. It's the Sanskrit of the Indo-Iranian branch of the larger, the larger group that we're talking about. It's the ancestor of Pahlavi or Middle Persian and modern Farsi and other languages like Balochi and Pashtun and so forth. Those are all part of like the Persian type languages. But Avestan, which is the language of the Zend Avesta, sometimes also used to be called Zend as well, is written in a very different script than Sanskrit, a right-to-left script related to the scripts of the Middle East. But the language itself has a lot in common with early Sanskrit. And interestingly, many of the gods, the deities in the Zoroastrian tradition are demons in the Hindu tradition and vice versa. So in some sense, whatever the language split involved, it may have also had to do with a cultural split and a religious split. But obviously this is all remote prehistory, and we really don't know much about that. There are some significant differences, of course, between the Zoroastrian religion and the deities and the worldview and that of Hinduism. I'm not really going to go into that much. But the point being that this language is Indo-Aryan / Indo-Iranian in early form, and so it has many of the same features as Sanskrit. But there are some differences. So forthwith, without any further babbling on my part, let's look at them. Now, if I can move this forward. There we go. Okay. So first of all, as I did mention in a previous discussion on language typology and the subsequent to that, there are some prepositions in this language, and they are signalized by at least 5 different signs, these being the ones I've been able to identify so far. So the first in the upper, now, and again, let me just say, for those of you who are familiar with Indo-European languages, and of course if you're a speaker of English, if you understand what I'm talking about, you're familiar with at least one, which is modern English, and you're familiar with the notion of prepositions. What you may be less familiar with is that not all languages have prepositions. Some languages prefer postpositions, which are exactly what they sound like. In other words, the sort of stuff that goes into prepositions in English would be tacked on to the end of words instead of going to the beginning. But all Indo-European languages are typically very prepositional. Dravidian languages are not prepositional; they're postpositional. So that's an interesting fact. But that's kind of irrelevant at this point because the language of the Harappan inscriptions is not an early form of Dravidian. And I can say this with no bias because I am in fact a Dravidianist, or have been. I've published fairly extensively in Dravidian linguistics. That's what I did my PhD at Cornell in, was Dravidian Tamil dialectology. I studied Tamil in Madurai in South India for a significant period of time. At one time, I was fairly fluent in Tamil. That's not so much the case now. So yeah, I mean, I know a lot about Dravidian languages, as much or more than I know about Indo-Aryan languages. But I've also done a lot of work in comparative Indo-European studies and historical linguistics generally. So that's where I'm coming from. Okay, anyway, so prepositions. The first one, the sign in the upper left, which has a variety of forms. The only commonality is it's basically a large square or near square with a bunch of internal ticks. And there are a bunch of allographic variations. You can see them, for example, in the ICIT, the Interactive Concordance of Indus Texts. If it's still available, I've been told that it's not available now, so I don't know what the situation is with the ICIT. I certainly hope that it continues to be available because it is a very valuable tool, although you do have to pay a subscription fee to be able to use it. But suffice it to say that there are a number of the variants of this sign, and the most common reading is para, P-A-R-A, which also happens to be a name, an attested personal given name in very early Vedic Sanskrit, but not afterwards. One doesn't find people running around in historical India named Para, but it was a name in the very earliest phases of Indo-Aryan, and we do see it used as such. In some cases, that sign occurs by itself and presumably denotes that name. But there's some ambiguity in that it sometimes also denotes pra, which is a separate preposition. There are two different prepositions in Sanskrit. Para roughly corresponds, pra corresponds roughly to Latin pro, and para corresponds to Latin per, P-E-R. Those are both, so Latin and also Greek had two different, similar but different prepositions involving a P and an R, the P and R sound, okay? But in Sanskrit, one thing you find is that a lot of the E vowel, the E in particular, often just becomes an A. So you find a lot more the use of the vowel a in Indo-Aryan and Indo-Iranian than you find, say, in Hellenic or Germanic or Latin, Romance languages and so forth. So para and pra are literal cognates with per and pro in Latin, and I forget what they are in Greek. But you also find these in Russian. You have pri, P-R-I, it's spelled E. But these prepositions are, in fact, the pre of preposition is actually, cognate with para, I guess. But anyway, now the other sign that there's some overlap is the thing that looks like a funny little spiral up in the middle, and that's this one right here. Okay, and this one seems to mostly just read pra. Okay, so sometimes for pra you get this one, and sometimes, but more often perhaps this one here, as in Ravi Prabhu. Or you can see this on the bottom here. Prabhu is our example. Prabhu, which means forearm, and it's a given name. But you could replace this with this, and it would still work. But it seems like this one only is pra. This one is para or pra. And again, you may ask why. Well, sometimes scripts do have more than one symbol that has the same sound. So, for example, the so-called soft C in English is indistinguishable from the sound of the letter S. So that's even in alphabetic scripts with their great precision in representing phonetics and phonology. Still, you sometimes almost inevitably have overlap like this. But the other thing is that, again, we don't really have a clear picture as to what the relative time depth of these different inscriptions in the corpus is. Perhaps some of the newer stuff coming out of Rahigari and Dolavira and more recent excavations, there's more seriation. But for the bulk of the material, which comes from the original, early and mid 20th century excavations at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and Kalibangan and a few other major spots, Chanhu-daru, downriver from Mohenjo-daro. These generally are not seriated, and so it's not clear. In some cases, it may well be the case, for example, that over time this one tended to replace this one, that originally this was the only sign that did that, then later this sign was developed later. I just don't know. The data is, and even, a lot of these seals, which constitute the bulk of the inscribed objects, are not necessarily dug up from strata in the ground. Some of them are exposed by flooding and this kind of thing, and so it's not an easy thing to discern. We do know that this writing was used over a period of at least 1,000 years, maybe more so. And of course, in that time, there's going to be changes in spelling conventions and in allography and the graphology of signs and this kind of thing. And so, for example, this sign has a number of different allographs. Again, were they all used more or less at the same time, or are they separated by spans of centuries? I don't know. All right, moving on. V. This double line represents the sound V. It's not always found in prefix position. And by the way, none of these signs, sensu stricto, are prefixes and nothing but. They can be deployed anywhere in the word that syllable is needed. So, for example, a V is often found also at the end of word. Well, not often, but it's sometimes found at the end of words, sometimes in the interior of words. But it also happens to be a preposition. And this is the reason that this sign is found, as we noted in an earlier discussion, very near the beginning of these lectures, that this sign is frequently, though not exclusively, found in word initial position. Okay? Now, this is the most interesting one, this one right here, whose primary meaning seems to be ati as a preposition, but may also be adhi in some cases, because as we've seen, voiced and devoiced consonants, as well as aspirate and unaspirated consonants, tend to be represented the same way in the script. Because, again, in the Bronze Age, things like phonology were not well understood. No one knew what a phoneme was. And so these writing systems typically, lumped a lot of... this is not unusual at all to see this kind of thing, this lack of exactitude in representing these sounds. So, let's see. Then we finally have su, and this one is found su, and it's also pronounced in some contexts so, as in the common word soma, which is written suma. Soma being a major Vedic deity. It also crops up in a number of names and sometimes by itself in the inscriptions. But su, as in the example given here, supatni, as a prefix means good, and in this sense it's a cognate. It's absolutely a cognate with the Greek prefix eu, as in eulogy and euphemism, and other words that begin with eu, euphony, what else? Words like this where everyone kind of knows that the EU means something good, and so these two are actually cognates. So this is a prefix found in at least two different branches of the Indo-European language family. So you can see some examples here of how this works. This one is kind of interesting. This one down here, paratma, is written oops, sorry about that. It's written para-atima, and in this case, ati is not a prefix. It's part of the word atma. Okay, atima is atma, and we're going to have more to say about that word coming right up. But here, it is a prefix, ati, or perhaps adhi in some cases, raja. And we've seen we also have ati raja raja, if you remember. Sometimes this sign is geminate. And in this case, it does mean, ati means high or extreme, or above all else. So it's a kind of an interesting prefix. I'm not sure that it has any obvious cognates in Latin or Greek, but there you have it. So those are some prepositions. So we have been able to ascertain, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there are prepositions in this language. Now, Indo-Aryan and Indo-European more broadly had a lot more prepositions than these. And so this is, there are many common prepositions that we haven't found yet. And this is probably because of the very limited nature of the material that we're dealing with. We don't have any long texts. Would that it were otherwise, but that's what makes this such a difficult problem, is that the texts are so brief and so difficult. All right, so let's move on now. So let's talk about one of my favorite words, the word atma, or atman is soul. And let's just go through this And hopefully you can see now clearly what I'm talking about. So Atman is an N-stem noun, meaning that in many cases other than the nominative singular, an N appears as part of the root, as with the ablative Atmana, which is it literally means by the soul, but it can also mean by oneself. So Atman sometimes also has the sense of self, and it's used almost like a reflexive pronoun in Sanskrit. So Atmana, Atmanam, and other forms where it has that. This is a very common feature of Indo-European. Generally, you have them in Latin as well, where you have nouns, particularly in the third declension in Latin, where the nominative case is different from all the other cases. So, for example, the word jus, which is one of the two main Latin words for law, it's spelled I-U-S, and that's the nominative case. But as soon as you get into the genitive case, an R pops up, and you get juris, and jure, and jurem, and so forth. That's where we get words like jurisprudence and juridical and words of this sort. So even in English, we tend to, when we borrow words from Latin, we tend to borrow the full form that includes, the added consonant that occurs in all the, the non-nominative cases. So this is what we're seeing here with the word Atma or Atman is something that is broadly characteristic of all of the ancient, well, at least all the ancient Indo-European languages that I'm acquainted with, and those would be Latin, Greek, Old Russian, and Hittite, in addition to the aforementioned Sanskrit, Pali, and Avestan. Those are the ones that I've studied in depth over the years. I don't claim to be an expert in all things Indo-European. I've never studied Gothic, for example, which is the oldest form of Germanic languages, so I'm genuinely not sure if this occurs there. It probably does. So there are a number of N-stem nouns in Sanskrit, but the thing that's interesting is, when it's used in its combined form, as we indicate here, when it's found as an element in other non-compounds, this Atman is almost always in the shortened form Atma. Okay? So this word so now the word that we're looking at is this one here. Atima, okay? Or atima. Now this could actually be long or short a. You remember my telling you that vowel length seems to be irrelevant in the Indus inscriptions. So that was something that they didn't really notice. They sort of recognized that and they regarded it as the same thing. And you'll notice that in the form atma, the first is long and the second one is short. So what that literally means is like that, And Indo-Aryan also had long and short I, and u, long and short u. So this is not restricted to the a. And so and this may be a little confusing for those of you who only speak English, and we say, well, when we say long a in English, we actually mean the diphthong a, which technically isn't a at all. But when the linguist says long and short, they literally mean longer and shorter in duration. And this is a very common differentiating factor in the inventories of phonemes of most languages, but not English, interestingly. So for the English here, there is no difference between saying and ah, or oo and oo. But in very many languages, there is. So that's what we're talking about, just to be crystal clear. So Atma, in the form that we have received, has a long ah there and a short ah here. Okay. But now we find in the indescriptions this form Atima, because elsewhere we've seen, and in fact this was the first time I identified this sign plausibly. I'll tell you how I came up with this value. You'll remember when I talked about the P signs, the titles. Well, one of the last ones that I resolved was the crescent-looking thing, and the only one that made sense, given the data, as I mentioned before, was the word Raja. And so, using that, I thought, well, this Raja seems to have this word in front of it that looks like a prefix. So what prefix occurs before Raja? And Ati is by far the most common. There really aren't any other prefixes that commonly occur with Raja. So I adopted that as a hypothetical value. It seemed reasonable enough, but I wasn't convinced. And then I noticed this pair, Atima, 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 which crops up again and again, and finally realized that what I was looking at was actually Atma. And at that point, the worm turned, so to speak. But now here's an interesting fact. Maybe Atima is not, well, let me just read what it says, and then we'll discuss it. So it is possible that this is just an approximative spelling, as are often found in early writing. Okay, so it may be that it reads literally Atima, but it's actually meant to be Atma, okay? But it is also possible that this is a phonetically accurate rendering of an earlier version of this word, which is listed as of uncertain origin by Monier Williams, Monier Williams being the author of probably the most widely used Sanskrit dictionary in existence, possibly coming from a root on, to breathe, or at, which is to move, or va, to blow. That's what Monier Williams says. But no one really knows for sure. But if the earlier form of the word was indeed atima, meaning atiman, would have been the full form with the n, right? The meaning would have literally been over mind, or superior mind. Ati, meaning over, or above, or higher, and man means mind. That's where the word manach is the full form, right? But the root man means thought or mind in Sanskrit, and in Indo-European generally. That's where the word mens and mentis in Latin, which means mind, and also the word for man, which in Sanskrit is manusha and manaha and this kind of thing. It literally means the thinker. That's where the word comes from. But man is a very ancient Indo-European word, and even in modern English, the word man and mind still kind of sound alike. And this attests to the fact that they have a common origin. So the point being is that this reading atima, which implies the full form atiman, okay, provides a very neat explanation for a very important word in South Asian culture, whose origin hitherto has been much disputed, that no one really knows the origin. Maybe it originally was the form atiman, which meant something like over soul, or high, or high soul, or high mind, high mind, or over mind, or something like that. That certainly describes the soul, as most people conceive of it to be, right? So now, the really interesting thing here, and I'm not saying this is necessarily absolutely the case, but I think the arguments are fairly compelling, because, well, let's just read the rest. The evolution from atima, the asterisk denotes like a hypothetical form, to atma is easily explained by the common linguistic process of compensatory lengthening. Namely, a vowel is lengthened to preserve the overall weight of the word when a sound is lost somewhere else. So in this case, the loss of the E in what was originally a three-syllable word could have triggered the compensatory lengthening of the initial to a. All right, now what's the point of this? The point is that there is such a thing as prosody. This is an aspect of language sound that a lot of people fail to appreciate. But languages tend to weight words differently. I mean, poets have long taken advantage of this. Sort of understand. There's this thing called a mora, which is essentially almost a unit of phonetic weight that words have. And a long ah, which is, by the way, more energetic, has more weight than a short ah. Okay? So the point being is that a full form like atma has essentially this, even though it's only two syllables, because the first syllable, ah, is long and very energetic, it has essentially the same weight, the same prosodic weight as the three-syllable word attima. And this is why compensatory lengthening of vowels, meaning lengthening of vowels, is a very common process in historical linguistics. So that's our hypothesis here, is that the word atma, as evidenced by the choice of signs used in the Indus script, may originally have been atima, atiman, from a longer form atiman, which would have literally meant high mind or over mind or something like that, i.e. soul, and at some point it became atma or something like that, but that triggered the compensatory lengthening of a in atma, and that's what we're dealing with here. So I don't know, take it for what you will. I think it's an interesting little fact. Either way, the presence of this word atma or atima or what have you is very, very powerful evidence, again, that we're dealing clearly with Indo-Aryan. Okay. What's next? Okay, so here are two more. They're similar. Here we don't really see compensatory lengthening so much, but we do have the two forms patini and rajani, two of the major P signs that we've seen. Pati, this one here, which means lord or husband or whatever, and is still found in most modern Indian languages, South Asian languages. This was very a lot of permanence, this word. And then Raja, this one here, okay, the word for king, have feminine forms, Patini and Rajani. At least that's what we have in the script, Patini and Rajani. Now, these two forms are attested in later Indo-Aryan, and here we have in the earliest form of Sanskrit, we have Patni, lady and wife, And Rajni, which means queen, which again very plausibly could have originally meant Rajani and shortened to Rajni. Notice that the N is a nya. It agrees with the previous. There's a certain amount of consonantal harmonizing that goes on in Sanskrit, and the even shorter form Rani, which crops up, and these all crop up in the original forms. So this first one, patini, occurs quite frequently, usually in P fields, just like this one here. This one occurs only twice, both times in P fields, but there's also an interesting instance where Rani also occurs. This one, Rani, is also found twice, and in one of those cases it's found as Raja Rani. This inscription here, which is inscription MH7207, that's in the Mahadevan Concordance, so if you have access to that, you can check and see that I'm not just blowing smoke here. So again, this I found out subsequent to getting values for these signs. I found this thing, Raja Rani. I thought, well, that's really cool. That confirms this reading. So it looks as though possibly the same time or perhaps at different time depths, both Rajani and Rani were found in the Indus languages. Presumably Rani is the most recent form because it looks like like a shortened version of Rajani. All right. So and as with Atma, these may turn out to be an accurate rendition of earlier forms of the words Patni and Rajni, namely Patini and Rajani. Okay, and it is worth mentioning that at least one modern Indo-Aryan language, and one that I actually happen to speak, Sinhala, does have the word Patini, wife, instead of Patni. Okay, that's how it's spelled in Sinhala. Whereas Patni is found in some modern languages, Hindi, for example, Patni is the word for wife in Hindi, although not in Urdu, but it is the word for wife in Hindi. Okay, so but languages like Hindi, they're trying more carefully to imitate the Sanskrit. In Sri Lanka, in the modern Sinhala and literary Sinhala, which are actually two different languages, Sinhalese Sinhala is a diglossic language, but they're a lot more conservative than many mainland Indo-Aryan languages, perhaps because of their isolation. Who knows? So, on the other hand, it could well be that Patini was just incidentally became the way they pronounced it in Sri Lanka. It may have nothing to do with this. But the point being is that we do find the form Patini here and there. There's also the goddess in Sri Lanka who has an extensive cult, the goddess Patini. Although in this case, that may be a slightly different word. It may have come from Tamil because there are two T's instead of one. Patini in the singular writing, there are two tas. But the final thing, and this is a little bit more whimsical, I don't know if it's really true, but the suffix ni, which is only found with these two. I mean, there's no devani for deva, no shrini for shri. Okay, just these two words that have this affix, this feminizing affix. But the affix ni is found elsewhere, and it produces compounds with preceding nouns with the sense of leading or guiding X. So if in theory, if I were to say, for example, go ni, where go means cow or cattle, it could mean leading cows. I don't know if that compound is actually attested, but that's what it would mean. So ni can be produced, and if that's truly what this ni is, okay, then patini may have originally meant guiding the pati and rajani guiding the rajan, and in some sense, women are the guides of men. I don't know that. Again, that may seem implausible, and perhaps that's a bit of a stretch, but I would point out that it's certainly possible, and it does make sense. I mean, after all, even in the ancient world, I would think they would recognize that the guiding role that women have, even with men of high authority like lords and kings and this sort of thing. So, although patini could simply mean guiding the husband or some such, I don't know. That's more speculative, but again. The point being is that the original forms may have had an additional syllable that is not evident in forms that have come down to us, even from the most ancient forms of Sanskrit, namely Vedic Sanskrit. Okay, let's see. Let's move on to, okay, this one's interesting. I've not talked about this before, so this will be new, even if you've watched and absorbed everything in the 10 previous lectures. This will be new. This is found only once, this inscription, and the sequence reads from right to left, Sahapapati. All right. So looking at that, it sounds an awful lot like the word Sabhapati, which in modern Hindi, for example, just means president. That's the president of the United States or the president of India. That's the word they use, Sabhapati. Literally, it means Lord of the Sabha. Sabha being, again, the word for any governing council. Nowadays in India, it means Congress or branch of House of the Legislature. So in India, you have, the Rajya Sabha, which is the Indian equivalent of the Senate. It's the higher house. And then the Lok Sabha, which is the Rajya Sabha means literally the ruling Sabha or the King's Sabha. Lok Sabha means the council of the people. It's the equivalent. It's the lower house. It's the popular elected house equivalent to the U.S. House of Representatives. So this word Sabha is very, very important, familiar word in modern Indian culture and politics, and it goes right back to Sanskrit. The problem is, as with Atma, the origin is not at all certain. No one really knows where this word comes from, but Sabha goes all the way back to, as we shall see, it's found in at least one inscription that I've seen. But the odd thing is, the way it's spelled, the original form of the word, as we note down here, is Sahapa. Okay, and if that's the original form, well, again, the meaning is pretty obvious. Saha means together or with someone else, and pa is the root, means ruling. It's actually the verb root pa, to rule. It's the same pa as found in pala, which is a very important word also. But this is the verbal root, and it's also used usually at the end of compounds to mean ruling something. Okay, so sahapa would mean ruling together. And so, how did it turn into sabha? Sabha. Okay, where in effect the position of the bilabial ba or pa is switched with the aspirate h. Well, this is another important and common historical linguistic process known as metathesis, whereby phonemes or syllables swap places over time. A really good example of metathesis in modern English is the tendency of many people, including a certain former U.S. president, for those of you who are over the age of 40, you'll know who I'm talking about, to say nuclear instead of nuclear. And in fact, I noticed just today that the boss of the company that I work for, who's a highly intelligent man, also says nuclear. And he ought to know better, but he actually used the word a couple times in the meeting this morning. I don't work for a nuclear power plant. It just came up incidentally in a conversation, and he said nuclear. So it's quite possible that in another 50 to 100 years, the old and more correct form nuclear, because it comes, of course, from Latin nucleus, which means a nucleus, will be replaced by this word nuclear, this innovation. All right. Also, for those of you who know Spanish, you may know the word alimaña, which is the Spanish word for any critter or varmint or bad animal that you need to shoot. Okay, is an alimaña. So foxes, coyotes, wolves, whatever, are all called alimañas, and they come from the Latin animalia. And in this case, you can see the L and the N have switched places in a multisyllabic word. So metathesis is a fairly common process. And my proposal then, and this lovely little inscription, opens with, in this case, the title in the P, and this is, of course, a typical P field, which you'll know now, usually has a name or a title of some sort, an honorific. In this case, the word is the familiar word sabhapati, but it's spelled sahapapati because, presumably, in an earlier stage of Indo-Aryan, sabha was actually sahapa, that one, or sahapa, technically. It's non-aspirate P, most likely. So that's what we're seeing. So this is a useful point because, again, sabha is such an important word in modern South Asian languages and culture. So you can see we can glean quite a bit from these inscriptions, even if maybe they're not as detailed and informative as we would like them to be. There's still some things that we can draw from them. Okay. Now, this one is perhaps the most interesting. This is the last one. And this is the use of ka, or ka, for genitive and possessive, or like it. Now, in Sanskrit, per se, there is an inflectional genitive case, which is usually it's just an as is the and sometimes asya for astem nouns, particularly later, not so much in the earlier forms. But basically, there's an actual ending that denotes the genitive case. And some of the modern genitives and other cases that you find in modern Indo-Aryan languages in South Asia are derived, however indirectly, from that genitive case. But here we see an affix, a non-case affix, ka, also being used, among other things, in a possessive or genitive sense of the word, like the apostrophe s or something like that. And it's kind of like in English. I mean, there's a couple of ways of expressing a genitive or possessive sense. One is to use the apostrophe, apostrophe s. So, for example, John's book. Okay, and that apostrophe s, I think, is derived from the Old Germanic genitive, but that's another story. But you can also say the book of John, or the book that belongs to John, or something like that, to convey the same thing. That's an analytic way of doing it. And so we see this here. Now this ka is an interesting and multifarious affix. It also can create a word somewhat diminutive, but having the same essential meaning. So for example, the first instance that I give here, the word devaka, does mean divine or of the god. That's one meaning. It's also a nominal, sort of an alternative form for deva itself. So sometimes you'll see devaka as an actual noun that it's not diminutive either. It's just another word for deva. So the uses of this is a very interesting affix. It's not a case affix, but it has several senses in attested Sanskrit. So we can see some other examples here where it's being used for possessive. Satyadeva ka, which means literally of Satyadeva, or belonging to Satyadeva. Satyadeva being a common attested name in early Sanskrit. And again, Rajasena ka, of Rajasena, which literally means king's army, by the way. But anyway, but that's not a common, but a well-attested name. Okay, so again, we see Rajasena ka. And these I didn't give the full inscriptions, but these are some examples. And finally, Madevaka, which I presume the Madeva part as actually shorthand for Mahadeva, because in a couple places the Ma sign actually is acting like it's Maha, and we don't find actually Maha written out anywhere. So anyway, but either way, Mahadevaka is another one, meaning of Mahadeva or Mahadevas or something like that. Now, the reason this is interesting, because we've come up with a number of such examples like this from the inscriptions, and the reason it's interesting is that a number of modern Indo-Aryan languages, as I note down below, use a genitive that looks a lot like this. Okay, this ka affix or form. Again, the standard genitive singular found in Sanskrit was us, but we have modern genitives in Hindi. Those of you who speak Hindi will know these: ka, and then ki, the feminine form, and ke, the plural form. That's the affix, and it looks. I mean, but where does this come from? If we're deriving it from the Sanskrit genitive, it doesn't make any sense. It just sort of popped up out of nowhere. Sinhala also has a genitive syllable of the form velar consonant followed by vowel, usually ge, like oyage, his, or minihage, the man's, or of the man, miniha meaning man, okay? And then Marathi has chachiche, corresponding to Hindi kakike, only in this case we have the velar becoming a palatal. Palatalization is a very common process with velars. So that's so clearly this comes from the same source. And even Hindi jo, another velarized, as in Mohenjo-daro, by the way. So Mohenjo-daro literally means, daro means tell or tepe or mound, okay, like archaeological ruin, a mound of ruins, okay. And then Mohan means dead, and jo is the genitive. So Mohenjo-daro literally is mound of the dead. And this jo is a very productive genitive affix, even in modern Sindhi. And that too, being as it starts with the voiced velar ja, the voice palatal ja, presumably it ultimately comes from the form like ka, and via lenition, which is a process whereby a harder sound becomes softer, so to speak, for want of a better term. So lenition from velars like ka and ga to cha and ja is another very common process. So not all modern Indo-Aryan languages have a genitive like this. So for example, if you look at Bengali and also Odia over in northeastern India, you find that the genitive there involves an R. It's a rhoticism, and I don't know where that came from historically, but it certainly didn't come from this source. So there are a number of different sources of genitives. It may have been a later innovation. I don't know. Okay, but the fact that such an element shows up in the Indus stage of Indo-Aryan as well as the earliest attested forms of Sanskrit is another interesting and even predictable feature of this language. So again, this is something that provides a very neat explanation for the ultimate origin of velar and similar genitive endings in modern Indo-Aryan languages like Hindi and Sinhala and Marathi and Sindhi, that they originally came from this form that we do find attested in the Indus writings, which is ka. Let me see, I think this is the last slide. Yes, it is. All right, well, that's all we have for today. And as I think of other things to talk about, I will post videos. I should mention also that I have turned the comments on now. I didn't know how to do that at first when I first upload these videos, but please comment anything, even if you just want to go on and call me names and tell me that you actually have the correct decipherment of the Indus script. That's okay, because we're all about free speech here, and we all are entitled to our opinions, so I don't mind at all. But I'm happy to, I'd like to see your insights. I would say that this is not a whole lot of information as far as the language is concerned, the grammar and all this kind of thing. I wish we had more, but this is what the evidence gives us at this point. As a linguist, I'm just itching to find out more. I'd like to know how the verbs work, this kind of thing. But it looks, at least in the form of language that we see on the seals, that the verbs are not written out in anything approaching full form. And, and in general, the script is rather elliptical, and a lot of interesting features like case endings and verb conjugational endings, seem to have been lost. Now, maybe there was a fuller form of this written language in texts outside of the seals. I don't know, but this is what we have so far. So anyway, that's all for now, and we'll see you the next time I think of something else to talk about on this channel.